You never really know when your life starts to rot. It doesn't happen all at once, not like in the movies. It starts slow, quiet, like a leak in a pipe behind the wall. By the time you notice the damp stains spreading across the paint, it's already too late. The structure's already fucked up. My name's Ethan Cross. I'm 39 years old, and I used to think I had a good life. Beautiful wife, Claire. Decent job, financial investigator for a mid-size firm in downtown Chicago. Two-bedroom condo with a skyline view and a dog that never barked. I used to believe stability was the same as happiness. I was wrong. Stability just means the knife takes longer to twist. The first crack appeared on a Thursday night. Claire said she'd be late from work. Quarterly review, nothing major. I believed her. She'd been working at the same marketing agency for years, and overtime was normal. But when I checked our shared calendar, I noticed she'd deleted the meeting entry that had been there earlier in the day. That small, stupid detail stuck in my head like a splinter. When she came home, I watched her change. Not the physical kind. She still had that same effortless elegance, but there was something new in her tone and the way she avoided my eyes. When I kissed her, she flinched. Just a little. Most men wouldn't notice, but I make my living noticing things. Patterns, inconsistencies, false trails, that's what I do. I poured 2 glasses of wine, turned on the music low, and asked, "How was your meeting?" She smiled. That kind of automatic smile people wear when they lie. "Exhausting," she said, pulling off her earrings. "But productive." Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it for a split second, too fast to read the name, and flipped it face down. I should have confronted her right then. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, played my part, and let the rot spread another inch. The next week, I started watching. Not obsessively at first, just casual curiosity. She began taking late-night showers again. Started wearing perfume she hadn't touched in years. When I asked who she was texting so much, she said it was Emily from work, her friend who'd moved to New York 6 months ago. I didn't argue. I just made a mental note. One evening, when she left her phone charging by the bed, I waited until she fell asleep. Her face looked peaceful, like nothing could disturb it. I slid the phone from under her hand and went through the messages. Nothing, empty, even the call logs looked clean, too clean. I've seen enough white-collar fraud to know when someone's sanitizing their tracks. She was deleting everything. I installed tracking software the next morning. I told myself it was for clarity, not control. A man needs to know the truth, doesn't he? Within 2 days, I had her location history. Tuesday, 7:45 p.m., working late. Her GPS pinged from Hotel Laren, downtown. A boutique place, quiet, discreet. I drove there the next night. Waited in the parking lot across the street, my car idling, rain tapping against the windshield like a nervous metronome. At 8:03 p.m. I saw her, black coat, hair tied back, stepping out of a cab. She didn't hesitate, walked straight into the lobby. 5 minutes later, a man in a navy suit joined her, tall, confident, smiling. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The familiarity between them was its own kind of intimacy. I sat there numb, staring at the revolving door long after they disappeared upstairs. Part of me wanted to go in to catch them in the act, to make a scene. But another part whispered, wait, see how deep it goes. When she came home later that night, she looked lighter, like a weight had been lifted off her chest. She kissed me before bed. I could still smell his cologne on her neck. That was the moment something in me broke. But it didn't shatter all at once. It fractured quietly, cleanly. And in that cold, empty space where love used to live, something else started to take root. A thought, a plan. You see, I've spent years investigating fraud, people hiding secrets in numbers, behind walls of data, layers of deception. Catching them isn't about rage. It's about patience. You wait, you document, you dismantle. So I began collecting evidence, not for divorce court, not for closure, but for precision. I found out who he was 2 days later, Marcus Hale. regional director at her agency, married, two kids. The kind of man who shakes your hand a little too firmly and calls everyone buddy. I pulled his financial records using back-end databases I technically wasn't supposed to access, offshore accounts, and declared income, side contracts through shell companies. He wasn't just cheating with my wife. He was embezzling from his firm. And just like that, my anger became something else entirely. Purpose. I started building a map, digital, physical, emotional. Every lie Claire told me, every night she worked late, every bank transfer Marcus made. It all connected. By the end of the week, I knew more about them than they knew about each other. One night, I stood in front of the mirror staring at my reflection. I barely recognized the man looking back. The eyes were hollow, the mouth calm, no rage, no sadness, just calculation. That's when I realized I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to ruin them, but not through violence. No, violence is messy, obvious, loud. This would be something cleaner, something that left no fingerprints, the kind of justice only someone like me could engineer. Revenge, I learned quickly, is an architecture. You don't start with fireworks and threats. You start with blueprints. You draft redundancies. You calculate tolerances. You build scaffolding for the collapse you intend to create. The first time I sat down to plan, I spread paper over my kitchen table like a surgeon laying out tools. Notes, dates, names, parallel timelines, digital feeds printed and pinned. Everything in its place. Nothing to chance. I wanted them to lose more than they would if the papers simply hit a desk or the police made a few inquiries. I wanted them to lose the comfortable illusions they'd built Marcus's carefully constructed image of a successful family man. Claire's belief that she could compartmentalize two lives without the compartments bleeding into one another. The humiliation had to be private, slow, and total, a dismantling of trust and currency both. Destroy him in his world. Make her watch the consequences arrive like a slowly sinking tide. I started small and humble. For 3 days I shadowed Marcus without leaving tracks he could trace. That's the beauty of being a man who spent a decade convincing powerful people their secrets were safe. You learn where the blind spots live. He drove the same gray Mercedes to the same parking garage and always took the elevator to the third-floor executive suites. He took long, aimless phone calls in the alley behind the bistro on Housestead. He had a preferred coffee shop that still took cash. He had habits. Habits or scenes. I needed access to his office, but I needed plausible deniability more. I called in an old favor. Years ago, I'd helped a concierge at a downtown building reroute a misplaced package that had belonged to a client. He owed me. One phone call and a daytime access badge was lent for vendor pickup. I walked into Marcus's domain as a man who belonged there, elbowed into the rhythm of the place. A pneumatic that read facilities. It felt obscene in the most delicious way. What I took from his office was nothing dramatic at first. A stack of invoices bound with a rubber band, an unlabeled flash drive tucked into a desk drawer, and a calendar with scribbles. The calendar was the most telling. A dozen entries marked client dinner, review, site visit, each followed by the initial CL or ML. I photographed everything and slipped it into my coat. The systems I used at work trained me not to leave fingerprints, literal or otherwise. My gloves smelled like oil and mint afterward. A small detail I noted and dismissed. Back home, I started the forensic work. The invoices were a mess of shell companies, nominal consulting fees, and a few glaringly crooked transfers. Places where money went to vanish. The flash drive revealed spreadsheets that didn't belong to Marcus's marketing firm. They were procurement bids, vendor lists, and most importantly references to an internal firmware rollout schedule across regional kiosks. The one line that mattered repeated in tables and comments. Auth token, cross-01. I held my breath when I read that. My name, my work, my architecture. He had the audacity to involve me in his scheme, possibly because of access I've had in the past, or because someone needed my fingerprints on a trail. Either way, the token was a lever, and levers can be moved. The plan diverged into three rails: exposure, isolation, and leverage. Exposure would be public but curated. I wasn't interested in a smear campaign where rumor drowned truth. I wanted truth to be undeniable. For that I needed more than emails and hearsay. I needed a paper trail that linked Lang's payments, Marcus's withdrawals, and Claire's physical act of carrying a token into my life. Forged documents can be demolished easily. Real documents, the ones that bear transaction IDs and timestamps, are durable. I had to manufacture a narrative that, when audited by anyone with motives to look, would bleed in the direction I wanted. Isolation was about removing support systems. Men like Marcus have colleagues, accountants, friends who will defend them until an accountant notices the books. Laura Claire had friends and a circle who would rally around a wife accused of infidelity. I needed those friends to step back on their own. Small seeds planted. A misdirected email subtly claiming Claire had been seen with an unknown man in a private suite. An accidental upload of a design board that included a credit line to a company Marcus used for bribes. People don't like embarrassment. They distance themselves faster than you can imagine. Leverage was the coldest rail. If the evidence did not crush him, I had to compel him to act stupidly. The man who reaches to silence a rumor usually leaves a clearer trail than the man who stays mute. So, I planned provocations designed to make him panic. A timed extraction of a dummy token. An anonymous call to a procurement official hinting at misappropriated firmware. An untraceable email to a journalist with a promise of bank records if they met live. To execute, I leaned on contacts Samira for physical tales. A ghosting service at the dark corner of my firm's network for untraceable dispatches. I engaged in a dance of half-truths. One of the first moves was to fabricate a client concern that required a security audit on the firmware slated for update. I drafted a plausible audit request and slipped it through channels I could engineer to look legitimate. When the audit team showed, Marcus blanched. He called in favors. He lied. Small inconsistencies bubbled up under the pressure of truth. At the same time, I fed Marcus small wins, fake confirmations of progress that encouraged arrogance. Arrogance is combustible. The more he thought the plan was working, the more he would send careless emails and use unsecured lines. I flagged a chain of messages where he instructed an intermediary to retrieve token from Claire. Use hotel drop. The message was marked, and I left breadcrumbs in the path he'd take, including a planted courier whose phone recorded a part of a conversation that mentioned the hotel name aloud. Parallel to all of this, I tightened the domestic noose. Claire's emails began receiving anonymous praise linked to an interior blog she'd published years ago, except the images had metadata pointing to the hotel suite where she met Marcus. I didn't hack her devices. I simply exploited a lazy photographer who stored backups on a cloud service without two-factor protection. The photos were real, the dates accurate. Laura's posts suddenly linked her professional self to private time and place. I watched her as the pressure mounted. People crumble poorly in private. Her replies to messages grew curt, then defensive. She began to avoid friends who might speak up. One by one her small comforts, late-night texts, weekend brunches fell away until she was alone with the man she'd meant to manipulate and the man who was watching her every move. Now the detective part of it. I needed Marcus to move in a way that allowed a clean handoff of culpability to him. I couldn't go straight to law enforcement, to public, to messy, and just as likely to be shot down by the lawyers and donors that protected men like him. The plan required evidence so damning and incontrovertible that his own internal mechanisms would betray him. I orchestrated a staged firm-wide security meeting. It was fake, an invented advisory. I seeded an announcement across internal channels that an urgent firmware review had been scheduled. Marcus, in his panic, would log in and attempt a token reissue to restore service. He did. He used the intermediary route. He talked fast to his contact, no encryption, no fuck. He gave a time, a place. He handed me everything on a rain-slick night. I followed him to a shadowed garage where the handoff was to occur. I stayed far enough to be invisible, close enough to catch the details. The courier arrived, small, quick hands, nervous, the token tucked into a cigarette pack like contraband. Marcus walked to the back of the van, a practiced motion. The video I recorded dangle, and clarity chosen for the prosecutor's heart captured the exchange. Marcus reeked of entitlement. Claire waited in the passenger seat, phone in hand. She wasn't triumphant. She was trembling. When I sent the clip anonymously, strategically timed to Marcus's board, his lawyers, and a journalist who specialized in corporate corruption, the dominoes finally moved. The board convened, Marcus had to answer, and the lawyer's first instinct was always to protect the company, not the man. Within 72 hours, his bank accounts clicked into lockdown, a subpoena dropped like a stone, and a PR team began to formulate damage control. They say karma catches up. I say logistics catches up when you design it well. But the part I hadn't anticipated, watching Claire watching it all, was a different cruelty than I expected. She called me once, just once, her voice a paper-thin thing. I didn't know, she said. The words were hollow and earnest in equal parts. I heard a life fold in on itself in that tone. She begged. She tried to explain. I listened and let the silence do most of the damage. My revenge kicked at my chest like an obedient, feral animal demanding blood. Yet when the board removed Marcus from his position, and legal fees began to pile, when the newspapers printed lines about embezzlement and authorizations gone wrong, I felt only a small, terrible satisfaction. The system had responded to its own pressure. I didn't want to be monstrous, but I had to make the consequences absolute. I crafted a dossier for lying Marcus's employers, keeping the right scraps and arranging them like a surgeon. There were bank transfers matched to shell accounts, vendor invoices, the courier footage, the token handoffs. I sealed it and mailed it to the investigative journalist with a courier's hunger. The headline the next morning read like a verdict: executive arrested in regional embezzlement scheme. Firm under review. Marcus tried to beg, to plead ignorance. He called Claire on the phone and left voicemails that made her tremble so badly she knocked glass against the counter. She fled to a friend's house that night and packed a bag. The next morning she was gone. I watched her leave from the high window of our kitchen. The city had that washed look it gets before a storm. I felt both hollow and full at once, hollow from the absence of the woman who'd once been my partner, full from the efficiency of what I'd accomplished. It sounds clinical, because it was. I had created a machine that, given the right inputs, produced the output I wanted. Engineering at its sternest, but systems have side effects. The air was thin. The downstairs neighbor noticed activity, late comings, and odd deliveries, and rumors began to stink around me. My firm's clients called with questions. The press asked pointed, polite things at industry dinners. Power has a way of asking for a price, and I hadn't paid mine yet. Then came the night I found the photo on my desk. It was a printed 4x6, slightly damp, placed like a gift on the blotter where I kept the bills. Marcus's face, defeated, hollow, stared up from a cafe table. Beside him, a new man, cropped hair, a lined jaw, eyes like poker chips. They both looked at the camera, not in surprise but in a cooperation that froze me. The back of the photo had one word, written in a deliberate hand: watch. That single word shifted the whole architecture. The trap had worked. The bait had been swallowed. But traps, even the best ones, also alert the other side. Someone had noticed me noticing. Someone had the courage to send a message: your curiosity has been noted. Up until that moment, I'd been operating like a man with a plan. From the next heartbeat onward, I felt like a man who'd revealed himself on purpose, part of a larger calculus that included predators I hadn't yet seen, the warehouse raids and the boardroom dramas, the legal filings and the news cycles, those were mine to design. But the delivery of that photo was a reminder that you never fully control outcomes. Men with power have backup plans. Men who lose have friends who still hold grudges. And men who thought they were manipulating a single string must always be ready for the full loom to shift. I folded the photo, slid it into my pocket, and for the first time in weeks, took a step back from the map on my kitchen table. The lines I'd drawn now suggested something deeper and older than a single affair. It implied a client I'd thought anonymous, a benefactor pulling strings behind the obvious players, someone whose tolerance for being exposed was low and whose methods for warning people were dangerous and precise. I told myself the right next move was to run, to hand everything to someone else, and let the law untangle what my hands had begun. But running felt like surrender, and surrender felt like death. So I turned the map back toward the city and started planning the next phase. The dossier that had toppled Marcus was not the last file I would assemble. There were deeper ledgers to find, names to trace in the soft paper of philanthropy and civic contracts. Meridian and Crane still sat in shadowed offices with their networks intact. I'd pulled one thread. Now I intended to pull the weave, but first I had to deal with the watcher, the man with the grainy grin in the new photograph. He had left the single-word note to tell me, "You're seen." I had to answer that message before someone else answered it for me. I lit a cigarette I didn't want, looked out over the city, and felt the cold certainty that I was no longer simply repairing a personal wound. I had started something that would ask for a price beyond professional reputation. I had started a war one didn't know if I could win, and yet I had one small advantage. I was the one who knew where the bodies were buried. They say the difference between being watched and being hunted is the quiet. When someone watches you, there's a rhythm, a recurring camera, a pattern of footsteps outside your building, a tail that shows up at the coffee shop 3 days in a row. When you're hunted, the quiet gets heavy. It thickens into the air like a pressure you can taste. After the photo with the single word on the back, the pressure settled over me and wouldn't lift. I spent the next 48 hours like a man on a wire. Every sound had a meaning. Every phone ring was a code. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. I slept on the couch with the television on as a poor kind of camouflage, light and noise in the room to falsify occupancy. I fed the dog more kibble than it needed. I drove without a destination. The city blurred, a collage of lights I barely registered. First thing I did was try to identify the man in the photo. It was grainy, but the angles were clear. A prominent cheekbone, a short scar on the temple, hands that suggested manual work, or at least someone who didn't flinch at physical labor. I ran facial recognition across databases I had legal and not so legal access to. A half-dozen possible matches came up: mercenaries, a bodyguard for a senator, and a contractor name that kept repeating in documents tied to Meridian acquisition: Gideon Voss. Gideon wasn't a person in polite company. He was the professional sort people hire when they want certainty and no oversight. He worked through proxies, his name tied to companies that sold security hardware and dispute resolution consulting, where the consulting sometimes involved persuasion that left bones and silence in its wake. When my feed returned Voss, the hair on my neck rose. He had the kind of resume that meant a quiet disappearance rather than a newspaper photo. Men like him don't leave a trail, they scorch the earth behind them. Still, I needed confirmation. Voss had been photographed at a couple of Meridian job sites years ago. His face had been caught at the edge of a crane operator's shot. The pixel quality was low, but the scar matched. If Gideon Voss was the watcher, this meant the people above Mercer and Crane had noticed me, and that they had someone who would not hesitate to make a warning tangible. I called Samira. "Tell him," I said, "if you can. If not, put eyes on anyone leaving Crane's office for the next week." Her voice was flat. "You don't go looking for a Voss. He looks back." The way she said it told me she already knew what I'd found. I didn't soften my reply. Then I'll make sure he doesn't look back." She agreed to try. While she organized Human Eyes, I organized other things. The first rule of surviving being watched is to make your home a theater, not a cage. I unplugged everything that broadcasted smart speakers. Webcams replaced routers with burnt bridges, and routed cameras I kept to encrypted. Local recording devices I buried in old picture frames, and behind smoke detectors, I bought metal locks that forced a drill to sound like an orchestra if you tried to bore them. I swapped my car's GPS module for a dummy. The practice felt theatrical, and precise, and small in the face of the architecture I was trying to dismantle. The second thing I did was go to the only place a man like Gideon ever thought to look away from, his boss's ledger. I had files from the Meridian branch that summer, and I had pulled from the warehouse serials for their Oranode units, shipping manifests, and a list of contractors who'd billed Meridian for installation oversight. I cross-referenced the contractor list against public licensing records and came up with a lead: a shell company called Red Hollow Security LLC, which had licensed dozens of short-term contracts and had been paid through a Mercer-controlled account. The wiring traced to a private account with limited access, small corporate accounts, prepaid cards, and a registered agent registered in a state I could bend if I needed to. Red Hollow was the kind of company that exists to be invisible. But money isn't invisible. It leaves fingerprints. I pulled bank metadata down to the last aggregate slice I had access to and found a pattern. A recurring weekly payment every Friday, exactly the kind of stipend you write when you want men on retainer, not payroll. I fed that patch of data into a small machine I keep for things like this, an old server in a closet at my firm that nobody uses but me, secured under a logical alias in a directory so boring no one would look. The server spat out routing details. One transfer showed a timestamp that matched a security withdrawal near Red Hook 2 weeks earlier. The ATM camera footage wasn't in any public system, but I had a contact, a kid who worked nights at the terminal cleaning crew. For a small fee and a big favor, he gave me an angle: someone with large hands and a limp leaving a strip mall past the time the courier had been there. The limp matched the way Gideon favored his right leg in a picture I'd found on a construction forum. The world was a tiny thing when you knew where to look. Then came the first violent thing. On Wednesday morning, I found my mailbox blown open and my apartment floor plastered with photocopies of the dossiers I'd compiled, the invoices, the courier photos, the ledger snippets, every stitch of the tapestry I'd been making. On top of the pile lay a business card, no name, just a symbol, Meridian's abstract logo with one clean, fatal message stamped in red: "Stop. There are threats, and there are messages." Threats shout, messages whisper. This was a message. Someone had wanted me to know they had access to my life, to my things, to how I slept. For a man who'd spent years burying other people's secrets, the violation felt like a cold insertion in the gut. I didn't call the cops. The police would ask questions. Questions would reach Mercer. Mercer would react. Instead, I did the only thing I could without becoming the obvious next target. I rewired the narrative. If someone was comfortable enough to tear through my mailbox and leave a card, they'd also be arrogant enough to replicate the move somewhere else. Arrogance existed for a reason. Men like Crane and Mercer are used to their reach, creating illusions of invincibility. They don't plan for the inverse, the quiet, methodical dismantling of their reach. I set a quiet trap. I took the Red Hollow payout schedule, and I fabricated a delay. I created a phantom invoice, a plausible ledger entry for maintenance on an Aurora plate. I inserted a code into the memo field, a nonsense string that only someone in the Meridian back office would parse as a reconciler. Then I pushed it not through the public web of transactions, but through a private channel I'd found 2 years earlier, a dark broker who trafficked in dirty contracts, and the sorts of reconciliations men like Mercer paid others to make without official oversight. The rationale was twofold. 1. Any man reading the memo would think the payment had been diverted and would want to correct it quietly. 2. The broker I used, call him Nash, was an egotistical man who loved leaving his mark. If Nash found this, he would show it to the right person and leak the wrong hint to the wrong man, and crucially, he would do it in a way that left a trail. The broker bit. Within 48 hours, someone at Meridian pinged Nash with a terse, coded question. Who touched payment F1634? Nash replied with the coded string I'd planted and added casually, maybe someone inside Meridian is nervous. The reply went to an internal thread. The thread had a distribution list. One of those names was Gideon Voss. I watched the thread like a hawk. That night, Samira called and said her tail had found Voss at a bar in the warehouse district alone nursing a scotch. He had a new limp, stiffer than in the photograph. He slouched, eyes scanning the room, and then he left in a hurry when a man in a black coat waved. Samira followed him to a white sedan and watched 3 men hand over an envelope. The men left the car. Voss drove down a dead end by the river and stayed. Samira took pictures, careful as always. She texted them to me. His movement created another problem for Meridian. Voss showed up at Crane's office the next morning. That was the moment I realized I'd done something reckless. I'd sent a traceable seed through a broker, and it had landed in a place where men who paid for discretion gather. Gideon's appearance at Crane's office should have been invisible. It was not. There were cameras outside Crane's building that, unlike mine, were not in my control. They showed Voss's car. They showed him entering. They showed him leaving with 2 other men. I pored over that footage until my eyes blurred. I found that between Voss's arrival and his departure, the building's security logs showed a brief, barely 30-minute green light where certain doors opened and closed without card swipes. An operator had overridden the logs. Someone with clearance had let him through. The operator's username was a bland admin alias. SYS_ops_22. I knew that alias. It belonged to an IT contractor I'd used once for a patch. The contractor's face flashed in my mind, but he was no longer available for comment. He'd gone quiet a fortnight ago after a supposed family emergency. Family emergencies are convenient when you're doing work you don't want to explain. This was moving up the ladder. Voss didn't walk into Crane's office as a hired hand. He walked in as a man delivering news. Whoever had tipped him off had access or leverage. At noon, a courier left a thin envelope at my doorstep and vanished. Inside, a single photograph, my kitchen table, the map of my plans spread out and annotated. Nothing else. No signature, no card, just a picture. They were getting closer. That evening, I sat under the yellow light of a diner and drank coffee while the city moved in a blur of its own making. Ephraim met me with his usual blend of moral fatigue and professional curiosity. "You've poked the wasps," he said, sliding an espresso across the table. "They don't like hands in their nests." "I know." I placed Gideon's photographs on the table. "Who is he working for?" "Crane, Moser. Someone above them." Ephraim's face went slate. The man had seen power in its many disguises. "You found Meridian's arm. That's enough to get men like Mercer sweating. But there's a sponsor above that. Someone who funds a network like Meridian does not do it for civic love. They do it for influence. They are not local. They are international, and careful. Any names?" He gave me one. Alden Fairfax. Quiet as a whisper, big as an echo. A financier who invested in infrastructure projects across 3 continents and owned shell trusts that held municipal contracts. Fairfax didn't show up in the Meridian paperwork, but he bought shares in their industry enough to make them useful. Fairfax was the sort of man who could order a thing done in a dozen legal jurisdictions and never be the one who touched it. I left the diner with more certainty than before. Fairfax was the shadow that cast Meridian's shape, and Voss was the muscle that enforced the shadow's will. That night, I heard the breathing behind my door. The way the city works. You learn how to tell the difference between the wind and the human breath. A soft pad on the stair. A key that didn't need metal. The jab of a coat sleeve on my door handle. I waited. Whatever came next was going to be loud or it was going to be deadly quiet. A slip of paper slid beneath the door. You're good, but be careful. The deeper you pull, the faster the fall comes. G. The initial letter was the same elegant hand that had written watch on the photo. Gideon had sent the card. Either someone was playing a complicated game to get me to stop, or they were baiting me into a pattern I couldn't escape, or both. I thought about burning the house down and starting again. I thought about disappearing to another country, changing my name. I thought about the dog and the old chair, and the way the skyline looked at night. I thought about Claire's voice trembling when she'd said she didn't know. I thought about Lang and Marcus, and the ledger, and the warehouse. I thought about the ledger again, and about the men who wanted their systems invisible. I decided to do neither. Running was cowardice disguised as survival. Burning everything would be the same as giving them the victory. Instead, I wrote back, on a postcard, an act of petty analog rebellion. I wrote a single line. You already lost your innocence, Gideon. Why steal mine? I left the postcard on my table like an act of defiance, and for an hour I felt foolish, small. Then I took the map from my kitchen drawer, folded it into a slim packet, and stuffed it into a nondescript box. I labeled it with Mercer's company tax ID and arranged for it to be found in a place where Meridian men would notice, a legal mailbox at a firm I'd used in the past, whose interns left things burning in their inboxes like unattended torches. If Mercer or Crane or their sponsors wanted to send messages, I could send a chorus back. The game had changed. They had gone up a level. So would I when the sun rose the next morning. The city was as indifferent as before. Cars moved, coffee shops filled, the skyline glinted like a blade. But under that indifferent surface, something had shifted. The Watcher had revealed himself. The ledger had a new name. The thread had been pulled, and now the fabric would not sit still, and I learned a new truth that day. When you poke a network, you don't break one string. You activate a loom. The patterns reveal themselves only when the whole thing moves. I folded the new map into the empty spot on my shelf, took the dog for a walk, and watched the city while pretending to be a man who had nothing left to lose. The truth is simpler and darker. I had everything to lose, and I was willing to risk it. They teach you in basic tradecraft that escalation is a scalpel, not a club. You cut, measure, and close the wound. You don't smash. But the men I'd unearthed didn't play by rules you could restrain with scalpel. They lived by an economy of escalation that looked a lot like violence clothed in spreadsheets. After Gideon's card and the postcard I'd left like a bad punctuation, the game changed. The loom I'd activated began to move on its own, threads tightening toward a pattern I hadn't fully seen. First, I had to admit something to myself. I'd crossed a line I could not uncross. Whatever anonymity had protected me before my role as background fixer, the way the world assumed men like me kept to their corners was gone. I was public enemy in a private war. That realization sharpened everything. It made me dangerous in a way I didn't fully like. It also made me more precise. I started with Fairfax. If Meridian was the machinery, Fairfax was the investor with the power to turn gears into policy. Ephraim's whisper of the financier had become my North Star. He didn't appear on any Meridian paperwork directly, of course he didn't. Men who live in the upper atmospheres of influence use struts of shell companies and philanthropic arms to keep their hands clean. But where there's money, there is paper. And where there's paper, there is always a mark, a registered agent, an intermediary, an innocuous donation, using a mesh of public records, a few favors at the state level, and the patience of a man who'd spent 39 years cataloging other people's sins. I began to build a map of Fairfax's reaches. There were trusts with blunt names: Fairfax Urban Trust, Fairfax Infrastructure Holdings, registered under layers of managers, and LLCs in states and countries that pretended not to see. But then a recurring donation to a city cultural initiative shortly after Meridian won a regional bid. The donation was routed through a charity that shared a tax preparer with Meridian's shell company. A wonky line in a W-9, a small, stupid human error. It was enough. I made a phone call to an analyst I'd once rescued from a mudslide of bad contracts. She was tenacious in a way that made me feel guilty for using her. She pulled a match on the charity account and pushed it through a chain of IRS IDs until the money hit a Cayman trust. From there, a series of transfers pinged at a registrar in Zurich. Zurich is a town of old banks and new habits. They sell discretion and call it service. The trick wasn't the discovery. It was the presentation. Fairfax's world was built to survive slow erosion. Staff people, legal teens, no single smoking gun. You don't topple a man like that with a paper trail alone. You topple him by forcing the wrong people into the same room with the wrong questions and then letting the markets do the rest. So I built a room. I used an old contact in London's press world, Denver's editor who'd taken a story that ruined the mayor and turned it into an international scandal. He owed me because I kept a favor that could have destroyed his career but didn't. I fed Danvers a narrative stitched from ledger excerpts, a ghost email thread, and the Orono manifests I'd pulled from the warehouse. I wrote the headline in his ear, Infrastructure for Influence, how private networks rewrote civic power. It sounded clean, and it would make the right people bleed. You'd be surprised how fast a billionaire becomes twitchy when headlines start to leap across continents. Fairfax called a conference, the kind of preemptive meeting where trustees gather, lawyers murmur, and PR rehearses its grief. They called it an emergency, as if they could smother suspicion before it caught flame. Men who spend their lives rearranging the world for profit hate the smell of scandal the way wolves hate fire. While Fairfax sweated, I needed to bait Gideon. Gideon was the muscle with an eagle the size of his scar. He wanted to be seen by people who mattered. He wanted to be noticed because noticing meant he had value. You can use that. I set a trap that appealed to his vanity but punished his instincts. I circulated, anonymously, a whisper to a few of the Meridian guys about a clean job in the old textile warehouse's cache. A short contract, non-disclosure, minimal fingerprints. They bit because men like Meridian think men like Gideon are consumable resources. I didn't go directly to Gideon. I let the rumor sing in the wires until it was impossible not to hear it. Then I arranged for a courier, Samira's old friend with a crooked smile, to leave a package in a locked locker at the bus station with a note that read, "For GVOS, 2,200 hours." Warehouse DI used a small camera trained on the locker to capture anyone who picked it up. At 10:30 p.m. I parked 3 blocks away and watched. The warehouse district is full of men who think the city owes them nothing and will take what it doesn't. Gideon arrived alone. He checked the street. He was cautious enough to make my mouth close with grudging respect. He opened the locker, found the package, and paused with it in his hands like a man holding a tray meant to be delivered to the gods. He left with the package. He took it to the warehouse. That's when the other players moved. I'd tipped Danvers enough to have a camera crew in the warehouse across from mine. It wasn't a huge crew, just 3 men, anonymous in black, who made the place look like a film set. They were not there to film art. They were there to record witnesses. When Gideon arrived at the marked terminal inside Warehouse D, he found the job waiting. A fake terminal rigged like a node, a stack of hardware that looked like the Aurora gear, and a contract waiting to be signed. He approached the terminal like a man closing a job. He touched the pads. The camera lenses caught his face, his hands, the package opening. And then the trap closed. I had arranged for a silent alarm, an old trick, cheese and mouse style. Samira cut the power to the emergency exits, and 3 men with Meridian badges arrived, wearing the faces of local security but the intent of hired wolves. Gideon had 2 choices, fight or submit. He chose to fight. The fight made me wish I'd never set the stage. Gideon moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who's broken a dozen people for a living. He hit one of the Meridian men so hard the man didn't get up for a while. Another shoved a pipe into Gideon's side. Gideon responded with a move that broke the man's cheek. A gun showed up in someone's hand on the Meridian side, and for the first time in weeks the living felt like the dead might finally be close. The camera crew filmed everything. Danvers's men filmed everything. The warehouse smelled of blood and oil. I didn't run into the fray. I didn't need to. I watched Gideon from the containers, my heart thudding in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with consequence. He fought like a cornered animal. He was badly hurt. He also won enough to limp away, holding the package like a talisman. My crew saw Mira and one other moved in after him with careful steps and recorded his retreat to the sedan. I followed with a distance large enough to be undetected but close enough to note license plates. The consequence, though, was not my making alone. A week later, one of Gideon's men turned up dead in a motel room. They hung the man with his belt, staged to look like an execution tied to debts unpaid. The city printed the story in their back pages, 3 paragraphs under a baseball recap. Meridian felt pressure where the legal world meets the violent one, and they flinched. In the meantime, Danvers published the piece on Fairfax. It was not a screaming front page blow the world rarely rearranges overnight, but it was surgical. Fairfax had to answer to fiduciaries who suddenly remembered their fiduciary duty. Board meetings in Zurich demanded clarity. Trustees who had previously been happy to be invisible now wanted to be seen as clean. Fairfax iced certain contributors and signaled a desire to cut ties quietly. The man who buys private networks for stability is less comfortable when his stability becomes a headline topic. But nothing that would remove Meridian. Meridian was agile. Meridian was patient. They had contingency plans for headlines and for death. They had lawyers who could conjure the right motions, whistleblowers who could be bought, and judges who could be persuaded. They were not a single no you could cut. They were a network. The price I paid began to accumulate. I found my garage door bent open one night, smashed from the outside. My dog's bowl overturned. I found half a cigarette on my carpet with a corner burned like a signature. Samira's apartment got a visit from 2 men dressed like utility workers who left fingerprints on her sink. The broker Nash started asking questions about my partners. The old comforts my firm's clients. The men who once gave me leads and calls started to become thin and intermittent. The veneer I'd worn at work peeled away with alarming speed. Worst of all, Claire called. She sounded less frightened than resigned. There was a tiredness like a drumbeat in her voice. "They called me at the agency," she said. "They asked questions. They want statements." "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them the truth," she said. "I told them I met Marcus and it was wrong. I told them I didn't know about anything else." "You sure?" My voice came out hard enough to crack. "Yes." She hesitated. "Michael, they said you were stirring the pot. They said you were putting people in danger. They said you'd gone too far." I told her nothing then. How could I explain that the woman I loved who'd betrayed me also sat on evidence that could save or destroy men? How could I tell her that the hand that had taken her had been paid by someone who cleaned up for the rich? She said, quietly, "I never wanted this." "Neither did I, Claire. Neither did I, but I'd crossed the point where choices narrowed to 2, be eaten or be the predator. That week, the city tightened around me like an invisible fist. I lost a client whose board feared association. I found my driver's logs audited by someone who had time to do such things. The envelope with my plans, the one I'd placed at the lawyer's office for Meridian men to find, went missing. Somebody had lifted it and read it, and then left a note in its place. "You know how to play. Why bring a knife to a gunfight?" The message was not a taunt. It was a fact. I realized, with the slow clarity of someone watching the sky change before a storm, that I'd done 2 things simultaneously. I'd revealed the existence of the loom, and I'd drawn the attention of every hand that held it. Men who make a living from the loom hate amateurs. They hate people like me who expose how the pattern is woven because professions rely on belief and opacity. If you pull one thread, many things may unravel, and powerful men prefer not to have their world unravel in front of anyone. So I prepared for the moment when unraveling becomes a battle. I reinforced my apartment steel on the doors, cameras to the perimeters I could control. I moved Samir's family further underground. I paid Danvers more than I wanted to in exchange for patience. I made sure the drive with Aurora manifests had multiple redundant copies buried in 3 continents under different names. I told myself this was all rational. Then Gideon's name appeared on a photo in my lobby. This time the photo was different. Crisp, glossy close-up. Gideon smiling at a dinner table with a man I didn't yet know, a senator whose name I'd seen in Fairfax's donation memos. The back of the photo had a new note. See what we can make you see. Stop. It was a promise and a map. And promises from men like Gideon come with invoices. I folded the photograph, put it into my pocket, and walked out into the city. The skyline cut the same way it always had. People were buying coffee and buying time. Somewhere, a child rode past on a scooter, and I felt that rare, small, useless stab of wanting normal. It was the thing that made me dangerous. I'd pulled at the loom until it moved. It had moved faster and more violently than I'd planned. Now the hands that owned it had noticed me. They'd sent muscle. They'd sent messages. They'd shown me photographs. The choice in front of me, like the ones that had come before, was not pretty. Run and live with the thing you started, or stand and try to tear the loom down, knowing the final cut might take you with it. I lit a cigarette and let the smoke ghost into the morning. The city didn't care which I chose. It would continue indifferent and hungry, its systems humming like a heart with a mind of its own. So I made one more phone call. "Ephraim," I said, "call in a favor. It's time we found out who buys Gideon Voss's dinner. When you pull on a web long enough, the whole thing trembles. Sometimes it collapses. Sometimes it tightens. Sometimes, if you are unlucky, the fly you freed finds its wings torn and dies before it hits the light." I'd pulled a lot of threads. I had watched men fall, heard glass houses shatter, and felt hands close like traps. Now the horizon had narrowed to 3 names: Gideon Voss, Alden Fairfax, and the senator at Gideon's table. The last phone call I made was to Ephraim Cole. The next ones I made were to men I'd rarely needed to call, politicians who owed favors. A judge who had once let a small truth go because I'd once paid him back with information that had saved his son's job. And a ghost inside a Swiss bank who still answered when I used code words. Ephraim moved first. He set a quiet pressure at the Department of Justice, a file that might wear out the shoes of a career prosecutor with something huge enough to make him care. Danvers put his piece in the London feed. It was careful and devastating in its restraint. Samira and her teams kept Gideon on the move, turning muscle into panic and making him sloppy. I watched it happen like a surgeon watching the blood run toward a clamp. We'd planned an execution of evidence, not a slaughter. The goal was to make the men above Mercer and Crane uncomfortable enough to withdraw their hands from Meridian. If Fairfax and the senator feared exposure at a scale that mattered to them, family foundations, trustees, international boards, they might step back. Men with more to lose often behave more ethically when ethics was measured in dollars at risk. On paper it should have been tidy. In practice, the city is a living organism with membranes and enzymes. It adapts. My cleanest move was a meeting I never attended physically. I built it on paper and on a set of servers tied to nothing, then fed 3 simple truths into different channels. 1. Gideon was on a payroll that ran not from Mercer but from a trust linked to Fairfax's philanthropic front. 2. The senator's campaign had received a wire whose routing matched Meridian's vendor accounts. 3. A cascade of audits, if triggered properly, would move from small local regulators to the Inspector General's office. I scheduled the cascade for a window where Danvers' piece would run in London, and a small Tampa paper I'd paid to publish would run a local amendment to different audiences, each of which would raise a fuss that would make trustees nervous. It worked in theory. It worked in practice, too, but not the way I anticipated. Gideon, cornered and desperate, did the only thing men like him do when the floor opens under their feet. He struck where it hurt and where his hands could reach. That morning my mailbox filled with a stack of photographs, new angles of events I'd assumed private. Someone had filmed Samira's safe house and circled the windows at midnight. A man with a long coat followed Danvers' photographer for a day and left a business card with a single word, "Stop." The message had changed from polite to procedural. I realized then that the loom had patience. It had contingency. It had men who were paid not to blink. And someone had decided, quietly and efficiently, that the cost of me was acceptable. The escalation that followed was the kind that unravels the last illusions you have about fairness. A contractor who'd helped me reverse engineer the Aurora manifest's good man, quiet, owed me a favor, was found 2 days after the Danvers piece, run into a river under suspicious circumstances. The official report said accidental drowning. The people who loved him knew the truth. We closed his funeral quietly, and I swallowed a feeling like the taste of iron. In that week, Fairfax did not retreat. If anything, he moved closer, not to fight me but to extinguish me. I learned this from a voicemail left on an old burner phone in my glove box. It was the senator, smooth, with a practiced calm. "Mr. Cross," he said, "you've made mistakes. There are jurisdictions where you belong to us now. Let this be your invitation to consider what you have to lose." The line clicked. I burned the burner and kept the message. The night I decided to stop flinching, I brought every copy of every drive I had into a single room and set up a chain of custody only I could break. I made a list of contingencies if I disappeared. Danvers would publish everything he had. Ephraim would leak the parts that mattered to the Inspector General. Samira would give my maps to a reporter with a hard conscience. I gave trusted envelopes to 3 separate people who had no reason to save me but every reason to avenge the dead: a judge, a female investigative reporter, and a man who had once been my enemy but owed his job to my intervention years ago. All of them promised, in their own way, the same thing: if you go dark, the world will not pretend you never existed. Then I went to find Gideon. It felt foolish, like an old man walking into a storm because he believes he can hold the rain with his hands. But I had a plan. The plan relied on 2 things Gideon could not resist: opportunity and pride. I left a note in a place I knew he'd see. A courier's locker tied to an account that traced back to Mercer's office but routed through a series of throwaway entities. In the locker, a package with a simulated brief for a job that would pay cash and clear a debt. The job looked easy on paper: deliver a physical device to a loading dock at the Larkin building that would allow Meridian to secure a new node. It was a bait made to look like hunger. I seeded the Larkin building with cameras disguised in maintenance scaffolding, and with an oversized mirror that allowed my people to see without being seen. Gideon showed at midnight. He expected to meet ghosts. He met Samira and one man whose fists are better than mine. He met people who had little patience for negotiation. They filmed the meeting. They watched the way Gideon handled the device, how he scanned the area with the kind of animal intelligence that made men like him valuable and dangerous. They followed him when he left, careful, along the Thames front roads, and watched as he arrived at a smaller house he frequented, the house with the dog that barked when strangers came. The recording we got was not clean. It was jagged, filled with static, but it included what mattered: Gideon meeting with a short, older man whose face I'd seen in the Euro documents as Fairfax's trustee, a man with the voice of a notary who sounds bored by sin. The meeting confirmed 2 truths. Gideon took orders from men above Meridian, and those men used him like a blunt instrument. The recording, when cut and presented to Danvers, made it onto the London feed the next morning. Fairfax did not answer his phone. Donors did. If you are reading this thinking that I was the hero of a script, you should know the city doesn't reward heroes in the way stories promise. The recordings ruffled feathers, yes. Fairfax took a hit on the afternoon tape. Trustees canceled meetings and flights. But in the twilight they regroup. Men who build networks do the same. When one node falls, they move the load to another. Meridian had redundancy. Fairfax had money. The senator had votes. And I had a ledger and a pulse. The night cracks came with thunder. Samira called me around midnight, breathless. Gideon had hit back. He'd found the safe house by triangulating a cell ping on a courier that had nothing to do with us, an interception. Someone he suspected had access to phone metadata, a resource you don't usually get without a domestic agency's altruism. The safe house had been watched for an hour. Men in dark coats had stood across the road, checking the windows like locksmiths. Samira's family were moved, but the move alerted the watchers. Gideon was angry. When he's angry, he is careless. They came for me 2 nights later. I smelled the diesel before I knew why. A van idled across the alley, engine off. My door clicked, and my hallway staircase filled with shadow. I'd expected the move for weeks, but expectation is a poor shield. 2 men forced the door. They were professionals, caller ID, silent steps, deliberate. One of them held a plastic gag folded like a promise. The other carried the black bag, nylon reinforced seams, a bag suited to removing people who won't come quietly. I had one small advantage: preparation you are embarrassed to admit saved you. I had rigged a countermeasure, not a gun. Guns are loud and life-swallowing, but a procedure. I had planned a simple exit before it was too late. It involved my old dashboard camera, a looped recording that would suggest I left the apartment hours earlier, and a relay that would ping my firm office 3 blocks away. It also involved no easy gestures. Throwing a life away is not theatrical. You do it slow, clean, with calculation. I burned the ledger of financials I could not trust in a trash can outside the building as the men pulled me from my hallway. Smoke curled like a secret. They found the ledger and frowned. They'd expected me to have nothing left. They'd expected me to be weak. My small, rehearsed comp surprised them. And when a man is surprised in his strategy, his hands become clumsy. They gagged me and got me into the van. For a moment, the door slammed like a final punctuation. I waited for the black bag to come over my head. I felt the canvas slide and heard the world become muffled. The van moved. It moved less than needed. Samira and her backup had cut the wrong corner at the wrong time, exact timing that made me curse under the bag. A second van, the one I'd hired as a decoy 2 days earlier, pulled close. The men in the first van lifted the bag and cursed under breath. There was an ugly moment of indecision, and then the sound of broken glass from the decoy van's windshield. Someone with a heavy tool smashed a side window. The first van swerved. They dumped me in the dark near the river and drove off. I lay on the cold concrete and listened to my own breathing as if it belonged to someone else. The bag was wet and the taste of stale air was metallic. My arms had a rope burn pattern. My watch felt like a relic on my wrist. When I staggered to my feet and made my way to a nearby alley phone, the world came back in cold, brutal snaps. They had tried to remove me, but not to kill me. That was a message. Gideon would have preferred I vanish. Someone above wanted me to live for a while longer, as an example. That was the cruelty of men who own systems. They can make you suffer for demonstration and save their hands for when they'd prefer to strike. When Danvers ran the edited clip the next day, Gideon meeting the trustee, Gideon at the warehouse, the senator in the frame, there was fallout. Fairfax's trustees flew into damage control. Meridian's boards started to fracture. The senator took a leave of absence. The press circled like small sharks. But the action that hurt most was quiet and bureaucratic, An inspector general's inquiry slow and clinical. That promised the sort of deep-level trouble men like Fairfax could feel in their bones. I thought then, maybe the loom could be cut. Maybe the network could be dismantled. But cutting is never clean. You lose fingers. The inquiry was real. It pried and probed. Men testified when subpoenas arrived. Gideon's men rattled in detention, and then evaporated like ghosts, springs uncoiled. The senator's aides leaked documents like grease to an engine. Fairfax's holdings were placed under review. His name sullied. Meridian's stock dipped in its private circles. The price was steep, but it mattered. In the eye of that storm I met Claire only once more. She came to a diner in the gray cold, and sat across from me, eyes watchful like a woman who'd learned not to trust intimacy. "You wanted to break things," she said. "You said you wanted to punish them for what they did. Did you also want to punish me?" She sounded smaller than the woman who'd walked away. "Do you feel better?" I was honest in a way that surprised both of us. "I feel like a man who has spent a year practicing how to breathe underwater. I don't know, maybe one day I'll surface, and it will all mean something. Right now it's just," I gestured, and the word empty felt shameful and precise. I wanted them to lose what they had. I wanted them to know what losing feels like. But I also wanted to know if I could be the kind of man who would do it and keep his soul. She looked at me with an expression that was pity without warmth. "You lost your way in a maze you thought you designed. There are things you can't put back. Maybe that's the price." She left the coffee half drunk. The vinyl chair against my back still held the shape of someone who once belonged there. I resented the way I loved, and resented where absence follows. The inquiry moved. Men lost positions. Men paid fines. Some men were quietly indicted, small ones, the ones who cleaned the engine. Fairfax's philanthropic foundation rebranded. Gideon vanished, no funeral, no obituary, but his face appeared in background checks 4 years after. Mercer pleaded ignorance and then resigned. Meridian reorganized, shuttered some of its shell operations, and in a meeting whose minutes I would never see, it reallocated risk to seats I couldn't reach. And me, I was a man who poked the loom and survived to tell it. The cost had been high. I'd lost friends. I'd lost a lover. I'd learned that vengeance is not a fire you start and then warm your hands at. It is a blast furnace that shapes the person at its center. They called it a victory. I called it a wound. Perhaps there is no difference. On the morning the senator resigned and Fairfax's name was a footnote in an international cable, I walked the city alone. My face in the shop windows was stranger every time. People asked at work if I wanted an extension on a project, as if nothing at all had happened. A client sent flowers, an awkward gesture from a man who wanted me to forget I'd ever broken a loop in his world. I donated anonymous copies of the Aurora manifests to 3 independent journalists, to a trust that would make sure they lived beyond boardrooms and bank vaults. I layered the truth in places that could not be owned, but the last thread remained. Power is animate. It learns. Systems rebuild. Men with resources never accept vulnerability as a final state. Meridian adapted. Fairfax's operations migrated to new countries. The senator had clones less visible, polite in public and efficient in private, and somewhere in the quiet, the loom stitched itself back, measuring and adjusting. They make new muscles. They hire men without names. They teach others how to cut a life with paperwork. I understood then that I had not destroyed the loom. I had taken out one node and fought it hemorrhage. That was something. It might protect someone else. It might have made 100 other things possible. It might have only made me more visible. On a wet night months later, after the dust settled into a new pattern, I received a postcard. No return address. The handwriting was familiar, steady, deliberate. The same hand that wrote "watch" on the back. In a single line were 2 words, "well done." Under that, in a smaller script, someone had added, "we have a file on you. Keep breathing." I held the card over the sink and watched the steam from the kettle gather like a small, obedient cloud. I burned the postcard in the pan and watched the paper curl into ash. The heat felt like meditation. The ash was fine and gray and quickly scattered on the wind. I had taken a network down, and some part of me had survived. The world was the same with new scenes. I had a city that might be safer in some small corners, and more dangerous in others. I had faces that no longer trusted me, and men who scowled in boardrooms when my name came up. I had a ledger with pages missing, and a set of friends who had paid with their sleep. If you ask me if you had the courage to ask me in a diner over bad coffee if it was worth it, I can tell you the honest thing. Some nights I wake up and I think yes. The scenes I pulled have saved children from a blackout, have stopped a procurement into crooked hands, have stopped men from taking another life because the law finally looked at them. Other nights I wake and only feel the weight of the hands I have become. I used the skills I'd honed for good. I used them for justice. I used them for vengeance. The difference between those uses is the shape of the damage they leave. I walk now in a world that has a new hum. I can't say the loom is destroyed. It will never be. The only honest thing I can give you is this. If you pull at a system, be ready to change. Wear a different skin afterward. The man who walked into the room at the beginning of this story is not the man who sits to write the end. That man is fractured, laterally different, and hard to recognize in a mirror that used to tell the truth. Sometimes I see Gideon in a place where men fold their hands and smoke. Sometimes a name unschools in the back pages of a paper, and I feel the small happiness of a blistered victory. Mostly I eat cheap meals and sleep in one-bedroom apartments and check the locks twice. I keep friends who will move a body and friends who will publish a ledger. I am pragmatic about loyalties now. If this story has a moral, if you insist it must, perhaps it's this. Revenge is a teacher with a sharp tongue. It instructs you in how to make men accountable, and it instructs you in how much of yourself you will need to offer before it listens. The last time I saw Claire after the trials, after the hearings, after the men had scrubbed their names to the best of their abilities, she said one thing: you didn't have to become them to stop them. She was right. She was right about the part that hurts. I had become a version of the thing I'd wanted to end. But I had saved a life or two, and I hadn't made an unfair contract of power in a system that counts breaths as currency. The postcard ash scattered into the gutter. The city took it, indifferent. The loom found new threads. The world kept humming. I keep walking. The dog sleeps at my feet. The skyline, that blade of light, keeps its edge. I have a new habit, a useless, human thing. When I pass the river at night, I glance over and imagine the faces embedded in the currents. I imagine names like Gideon and Fairfax loosening in their sleep, and sometimes in the small, luminous hours, I whisper into the water the one thing I never know if I mean, forgive me.